Okay, let's see here. Trying to think what page I'm on. Let's see. Did I talk about this? I thought I did, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm going to start with page 23 of Ludwig Pasteur's. I think I finished Vala's stuff. Okay, so yeah, so I think I'm assuming that we went past Vala. So we're on Antonio Baccadelli Panormetta. All right, so I'm on page 23, starting there. Vala's audacious attack on Christian morals in his dialogue on pleasure was far surpassed by Antonio Baccadelli Panormita, died 1471. Repulsive thought though the subject be, we must speak of his Hermaphroditus, or collection of epigrams, because the spirit of the false Renaissance is here manifested in all its hideousness. The book, says the historian of humanism, opens a view into the abyss of iniquity, but wreathes it with the most beautiful flowers of poetry. The most horrible crimes of the heathen antiquity, crimes whose very name a Christian cannot utter without reluctance, were here openly glorified. The poet, in his vastly verses, toyed with the worst forms of sensuality, as if they were the most natural and familiar themes for wit and merriment. And moreover, he complacently confessed himself the author of this obscene book, justified it by the examples of the old Roman poets, and looked down upon the strict guardians of morality as narrow-minded dullards, incapable of appreciating the voluminous graces of the ancients. Cosimo de' Medici accepted the dedication of this uh, loathsome book, which is provided by countless copies in the Italian libraries to have had but too wide a circulation. Beccadelli's disgraceful work did not, unfortunately, stand alone, for Poggio, Philo, and Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini have much to answer for the way of highly seasoned anecdotes and adventures. No writing of the so-called humanists, however, equals Beccadelli's collection of epigrams in impurity. The false heathen Renaissance culminates in this repulsive emancipation of the flesh, sacrosanchously characterized by a modern historian as the forerunner of the Great Revolution, which in the following centuries shook Europe to its center. And just, yeah, they're talking about the French Revolution. The representatives of the church, who in later times were often too indulgent toward the manifold excess of humanists, happily did their duty on this occasion, and met this appalling fruit of faith in the infallibility of the ancients with decision. Pope Eugenius IV forbade the reading of this work under pain of excommunication. Cardinal Cesarini, a zealous friend of humanism, destroyed it whenever he could get possession of it. And the most celebrated preachers of the day, St. Bernard of Siena and Roberto de' Lici, earnestly warned their hearers against such vile literature circulated by the ecclesiastical party. The manuscript of a long indictment against Piccadelli, composed by the Franciscans Antonio de' Ro, is preserved in the Ambrosian Library at Milan. The Carthusians, Bruno del Volterra, composed a poem against him, and learned Minorite Alberto da Sorrentino wrote a letter of warning to the young men of Fiera, and also a large work with a view of countering the influence of this impure poet. The sensation caused by this vile book was so great that even Poggio, who was certainly by no means over particular in such matters, advised Piccadilly in future to choose graver subjects, inasmuch as, quote, Christian poets are not allowed the license enjoyed by the heathen. Piccadilly had the insolence to defend himself against this slight reproof, which was not very seriously meant, but an appeal to the authority of the ancients. A great many learned, worthy, holy Greeks and Romans had, he said, sung of such things, and yet the works of Catullus, Tiberius, Propertius, Juvenal, Martial, Virgil, and Ovid were universally read. The very prince of philosophers. Plato himself had written wanted verses. Piccadilly then gives a list of Greek philosophers and statesmen who indulged in writings of this description and yet been virtuous. Similarly, in his epigrams, he had been careful to declare that although his writings were immodest, his life was spotless. If Piccadilly really believed what he said, daily experience should have taught him another lesson. The horrible crimes which had been the curse of the ancient world, and which were the theme of his elegant verses, raged like a moral pestilence in the time in the larger towns of Italy, especially among the higher classes of society. Florence, Siena, Naples, were described as the chief seats of these excesses. In Siena, indeed, in the beginning of the 15th century, it had been found necessary, as in the ancient Rome, to legislate against the prevailing celibacy of men. Lucca and Venice also bore an evil name in regard to the prevalence of those vices, which had no small share in bringing about the downfall of Greece. Corrupting effects of the false profligate humanism represented by Valla and Piccadilly made themselves felt to an alarming extent in the province of religion as well as that of ethics. Enthusiasm for everything connected with the ancient world was carried to an excess that the forms of antiquity alone were held to be beautiful, and its ideas alone to be true. The ancient literature came to be looked upon as capable of satisfying every spiritual need, and as sufficing for the perfection of humanity. Accordingly, its admirers sought to resuscitate ancient life as a whole, and that the life of the period of the decadence with which alone they were acquainted. Grave deviations from Christian modes of thought and conduct were the necessary consequences of such opinions. In the beginning of the 15th century, Sino de Rinuccini brought forward a list of serious charges against the adherents of false Renaissance. They praise Cicero's work De Officis, he says, but they ignore the duty of controlling their passions and regulating their life according to the rules of Christian chastity. They are devoid of all marriage. They're devoid. Sorry, they are devoid of all marry. I said it again. They are devoid of all family affection. They despise the holy institution of marriage and live without rule. They avoid all labor for the state, either by word or action, saying that he who serves the community serves nobody. As to theology, they give undue praise to Varro's work and secretly prefer them to the fathers of the church. They even presume to assert that the heathen gods had a more real existence than the God of the Christian religion, and they will not remember the wonders wrought by the saints. There may be perhaps some exaggeration in these charges, but it cannot be denied that enthusiastic admiration for the ancients exercised the most deleterious influence on the Christian conscience and life of the representatives of the false Renaissance. Even Petrarch lamented the fact that to confess the Christian faith and esteem it higher than the heathen philosophy was called stupidity and ignorance, and that people went so far as to deem literary culture incompatible with faith. It's recorded of the celebrated Florentine statesman Rinaldo Delgo Albizzi that he held a disputation with a physician versed in philosophy on the question whether science is in opposition to Christian faith. Like Petro, Pom Pomponazzo, Pomponazzo, Zao. A century later, Albizzi maintained the affirmative, supporting his opinions by quoting quotations from Aristotle. Carlo Marsupini of Arezzo, the state chancellor of the Florentine, openly manifested great contempt for Christianity and unbounded admiration for the heathen religion. He adhered to these sentiments to the end, and the contemporary says he died without confession or communion, and not a good Christian, and not as a good Christian. Few however went to such lengths. Most of these men, when the reality of death drew near, abandoned their empty speculations, and a penitent return to the dogmas of the faith took the place of their former vulgaries. Even such men as Cordro, Ursino, and Machiavelli, before their end, sought the aid of the church, which their lives and opinions had estranged them, and whose graces and blessings their writings had contend. They died after making their confession, fortified with the consolation of religion. The adherents of the false Renaissance, with scarcely an exception, were during life indifferent to religion. They looked on the classical studies, their ancient philosophies, and the faith of the church as two distinct worlds, which had no point of contact. From consideration of their worldly prudence and convenience, they still professed themselves Catholics, while in their hearts they were more or less alienated from the church. In many cases, indeed, the very foundation of faith and morals were undermined by the triumph of false humanism. The literary men, and artists of this school lived in their ideal world of the classical dreams. Theirs was a proud and isolated existence. The real world of social and yet more that of moral and religious life, with its needs, its struggles and sacrifices, was far too common and too burdensome for their notice, and they only condescended to take part in it insofar as was necessary in order to bring themselves into view and to share in its advantages. Overweening self-esteem was characteristic of these men. They never thought themselves sufficiently appreciated. Some of them, as for example, Balvo, cherished a fixed idea that they were the geniuses of their age and that the whole world must give way to them because they spoke Greek and wrote Latin with elegance. Notwithstanding all the stoical phrases which adorned their discourses and writings, humans were fond of money and good cheer, desirous of honor and admiration, eager to find favor with rich and noble, quarrelsome amongst themselves, ready for any intrigue, calamity, or baseness that would serve to ruin a rival. Poggio Bracciolini may be taken as a genuine representative of this false humanism. This gifted writer, the most fortunate discoverer the world has ever known in the field of literature, is as a man one of the most repulsive figures of the period. Almost all the vices of the profligate Renaissance are to be found combined in this person, and it would be hard to say whether his slanderous disposition or the engrossing morality of his life is most worthy of condemnation. Notwithstanding occasional expression of another kind in his writings, there would be no doubt that Poggio's point of view was more heathen than Christian. Christianity and the church were entirely outside his sphere. To quote the words of the biography Aeneas Silvus Piccolomini, he, for example, is heathen, or rather indifferent state of mind, is furnished by his well-known letter to the Council of Constance on the occasion of the burning of Jerome of Prague. Poggio speaks with the greatest enthusiasm of Jerome, from which, however, it is not to be inferred that he approved of his opinions. On the contrary, the, the conception of a martyr to any faith was as foreign to the mind of this follower as the false Renaissance as to that of a heretic. The kind which he admired in Jerome was of a very different kind. The courage with which this man met death reminded him of Cato and of Mutus Scaevola, and he considered the eloquence of his address to the council as approaching that of the ancients. The decision of the ecclesiastical authority is scarcely noticed by Poggio. He only regrets that so noble an intellect should have turned to heresy. If, he adds, the accusations brought against him are true. This doubt is, however, disposed of by the cool observation. It is not my business to judge of the matter. I contented myself with the opinion of those who are considered wiser than I am. Most of the writings of Poggio are offensively obscene and coarse. The worst in this respect, after his Festa, are his shameless and immoral letter on the license which prevailed at the baths of Zurich, and his libels of Filofo and Bala. Like the lowest boy out of the street, says the historian of humanism, Poggio assails his adversary with coarsest abuse and base calamity. He accuses these two humanists of every kind of turpitude, and the greater part of the work is unfit for translation. The impression produced is a strange one when a writer whose own life was so far from respectable sets himself up as a censor and depraved morals of the monks and clergy. Poggio cannot find words sufficiently stinging with which to brand the hypocrisy, cupidity, ignorance, arrogance, and morality of the clergy. The monks, however, are ever the special object of his sarcasm, often indeed in discourse, letters, and treaties, where such sentiments might least have been looked for. Violent attacks upon them are to be found, as in his dialogues on avarice and on human misery, and in his book against hypocrites. There are monks, he says, who call themselves mendicant friars, but it seems rather that they bring others to beggary, being themselves idle and living by the sweat of other men. Some of these assume the name of observantines. I do not know what good all these can be said to do. I only know that most who call themselves minorites and observantines are rude peasants and idle mercenaries who aim not at holiness of life, but at escaping from work. Even in their preaching, according to Poggio, the object of the monks is not the healing of sick souls, but their applause of the simple folk whom they entertain with buffooneries. They indulge their boorish loquacy without restraint and are often more like apes than preachers. All right, I'm gonna pause here. I think I'm on page 30, halfway done. Let me look at the notes though, see if I have any notes I want to read. Now, here's an interesting quote. The arrival of learning was the first act of this immense moral transformation in which Europe was involved, and whose marked epochs are the Italian Renaissance, the German Reformation, and the French Revolution. In reference to Luther's connection with the libertine humanism, see Protestant policy. I have to look up that person then. Mhm. The position here, this is a note. The position of these humanists in regard to the church was naturally very different from that which the two founders and pioneers of the Renaissance had occupied. The steady growth of this false tendency during the latter part of the 15th century will be described in a future volume of this work. The false Renaissance is not to be considered as responsible for the immorality of the age. It aggravated it, but was not the sole cause. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. Okay.